27th PFF? Are you kidding me? Oh my gosh. If you don't know what I'm talking about, PFF last week released their ranking of all 32 NFL teams' rosters as of this offseason. Where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses? Who's an X factor? And who are some rookies to watch? They had the Packers 27th. Sixth worst roster in the NFL according to PFF. Next worst in the NFC North was the Chicago Bears at 22nd, followed by the Minnesota Vikings at 16th, and then the Lions, as many of you may have expected, the best roster in the NFC North with the 13th ranked roster. So what was their real assessment? What did PFF think about the Packers roster that made them so bad? Well, let's start with their strong point first. The strength of the Packers roster, according to PFF, is their running backs. And I don't think many people would really argue that. Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon together are a great backfield combination. They each bring a little bit different aspect to the game. Dillon is kind of your power back that can really, get you some tough yardage, while Jones is a little bit more elusive and more of a passing threat out of the backfield. So no arguments there. I think that is a fair assessment of that strength on the Packers roster. I would argue probably up there as well, while early last year it wasn't, would be the offensive line. Our offensive line, we've got 6 quality starters. I know there's only 5 positions across the line, but I think either way, if you end up with Zach Tom at right tackle or Josh Nijman at right tackle, or even if you have Zach Tom competing for center, I think any way you rotate that, they're going to have a quality offensive line. You don't have 2 guys coming off ACL injuries like we did last year. That was really kind of a bit of a slowing factor, especially starting guys like Royce Newman on the offensive line against Minnesota in week 1. So I would say their offensive line is a strength. Not to mention the versatility, where you do have players like Elton could basically play all 5 positions. Last year is a little rough at right tackle, but he can still, move around and shift. I would say Zach Tom is probably in that same category as well. And really the weakest point right now, it would seem, on the offensive line is the center. And there is some question about how much of, Josh Myers' setbacks have been really just a matter of the pressure that was placed on him from, Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers isn't always the easiest teammate to play with, but taking some of those, some of that pressure off by having a younger quarterback in Jordan Love, who might just rely more on his center to make some of those protection calls rather than really kind of being subject to whatever Aaron saw on the field at any given time. That would be one of my strengths. They, at PFF, thought the weakest part of the Packers roster was not having enough dynamic pass catchers. Dynamic pass catchers, all that. They bring in, and invoke, Allen Lazard leaving, Randall Cobb leaving, Robert Tonyan leaving. I would argue that effectively none of those 3 were particularly dynamic last year. Don't get me wrong, I liked what Allen Lazard brought to the team. What he did wasn't, your big threat, big play type of receiver, though. He was a steady down in, down out, brought something to the running game as an outstanding blocker. And he was consistent and reliable. You could go to him on 3rd down and get, even if he wasn't open and he was a contested catch, you're willing to put the ball in his hands and have him go make a play. But it wasn't dynamic. You weren't making splash plays with Allen Lazard. Randall Cobb, while, injured in and out, the last several seasons, doesn't have the same, juice that he had when he was a younger receiver in Green Bay. So I would say that he probably wasn't that dynamic. And then Robert Tonyan really hasn't been dynamic since before his ACL injury. There was signs that he was kind of coming back a little bit slowly, but he doesn't quite seem to have the same explosiveness. So invoking those three players as losses in part of the not having enough dynamic pass catchers, I would argue, while unproven and very, very green, the rookies that the Packers brought a lot of dynamicism. So Luke Musgrave, dynamic threat. Tucker Kraft, dynamic run after the catch. Jaden Reed, dynamic both from like a slot fade kind of perspective and downfield, but also just very elusive and quick in and out of his breaks. So I think there's dynamicism there. Not to mention Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson in year 2, who I expect will have at least some elevation in their play. I just don't see that that's the greatest weakness. The Packers roster is not without its fair share of weaknesses, don't get me wrong. I would even say like our special teams is still probably a little bit more of a weakness. We brought back a lot of guys to help shore that up, and Keyshawn Nixon in the return game, a lot of the core special teamers like Dallin Levitt, Tyler Davis out of the tight end room on that team, and then bringing in like Tarvarius Moore and bringing in Matt Orzech as a new long snapper, and bringing back Pack O'Donnell is a good thing. But I mean, we're going to have a new kicker, most likely, if you believe the Molly, Crosby tweet or not, but probably a new kicker, and then a bit of turnover, as we don't know who of those guys are still going to make the roster, which really brings me into the fact that we've got like 10 safeties on the roster right now. And that is where I would say our biggest weakness is. We don't have a clear-cut idea of who's starting at safety. I mean, I know that it's been talked about that, Savage is probably going to be starting at safety, which I generally support, as, he's got the potential, though he hasn't produced on it the last couple of years. But I would say he has a very short leash. But when it's up between Savage, Ford, a 7th round pick rookie, and Jonathan Owens, who we just signed from the Houston Texans, who started most of last season, but still graded in the 60s for his PFF grade as a safety. When those are our options, I would say that's probably our weakest point. The way the Packers have kind of approached it, I look at that as kind of throw enough spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. So that's where we're at the safety position. I would also say, in a similar unproven kind of sense, the defensive line. We brought in some youth, and don't get me wrong, I'm really excited about Colby Wooden, and I'm also excited about Carl Brooks, but they're a little bit different body types than what we've had. And we've got very little experienced players across the line. We're really looking at, Kenny Clark to kind of bring them all together, and then TJ Slayton as, the next most senior guy on that line. Like, we're pretty young there, and I'm excited about what they might be able to put together and do, and some of the versatility that I think our young draft picks have, even including Lucas Van Ness, who can probably rotate in some different spots there. But that's probably a weakness. When you're relying heavily on, young, inexperienced players on defense, bad things can happen. So that's not to say, that our roster is the 27th worst roster. I still think we're somewhere kind of in the, late teens, maybe mid-teens kind of area, 15 to 18-ish probably in the roster. As PFF called it, their X factor was Jordan Love. And I don't think anybody would expect anybody other than that, because when you're transitioning from a 4-time MVP quarterback who's an inevitable first ballot Hall of Famer, you're going to have some questions about who's coming in to replace him. But he couldn't be in a better situation to start. Everything's, kind of getting put behind him, and they've got a quality roster around him. Is he, a linchpin in that? Absolutely. But at the same time, it's not like all of the weight is solely on Jordan's shoulders. And then for the rookies that PFF, wanted to call some attention to, they really called out both the rookie tight ends. So Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. I think they can play a pretty dynamic role in this offense, even though they aren't necessarily going to be, outstanding blockers as like a Mercedes Lewis would have been. I think they'll be getting limited action in the pass game. I think it'll slowly turn into that. But you get two big tight ends like them, and even in the red zone, they can make an impact in that area alone. The name that I would call out to watch the most for the rookies, in my opinion, is Jayden Reed. I think he can be a dynamic option as a slot in this offense. And I mean, it's already been rumored out there that he's getting in on some of the jet sweep or motion type concepts, which I think will have a big comeback in Matt LaFleur's offense this year. So him seeing the field a lot in that kind of role, but then also being able to, really shake things up a little bit. And he can still win vertically. So it can be, or he kind of takes the top off the defense, and that leaves it open for Romeo Doubs or Christian Watson across, on some crossing routes, or even like the tight ends in the middle field, splitting those safeties and kind of giving Jordan Love some options to target the middle of the field. I think that's really what we're going to see more of in the Matt LaFleur offense. So I think Jayden Reed, whether it's through like traditional production or just through, kind of cloak and dagger stuff with, jet sweeps and motions and things like that, I think he's going to have a huge impact on the Packers offense. But I want to know what you think. Is PFF right on this, with the 27th ranked roster in the NFL? Or are you a little bit more on my side of things where you see we're kind of, middle of the pack? I find it hard to believe that the Bears, for one, have a roster that's better than the Green Bay Packers. But that's just me. But leave a comment down below. Like this video if you think there was some good value out of this, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more of the videos from the Green Bay Football Corporation.